More delicious legacy media drama.
Former New York Times writer Paul Krugman just released an article on The Contrarian detailing his rationale for leaving the Grey Lady.
The great former New York Times columnist writes, despite the
encomiums.
What is that word?
Encomiums.
I've never heard that word before.
Praise.
Issued by the Times, it was not a happy departure. Thank you for setting me straight there, Niall. From my perspective, the nature of my relationship with the Times had degenerated to a point where I couldn't stay.
Krugman then went into specifics. Faced attempts from others to dictate what I could and could not write about, usually in the form you've already written about that. As if it never takes more than one column to effectively cover a subject. If that had been the rule during my earlier tenure, I would never have been able to press the case for Obamacare, or against Social Security privatisation, and most alarmingly against the Iraq invasion. Krugman added that Times opinion writers were banned from engaging in media criticism.
Krugman also told the Columbia Journal-Review recently that he approached the days he wrote his columns with dread and often spent the afternoon in rage after they were published.
Krugman says the editors made his life hell.
Tech and media journalist Simon Owens wrote on X, the New York Times told Paul Krugman he was publishing too much content, he quit, launched a Substack newsletter. This is another example of the legacy media failing to understand how much the power balance has shifted in recent years. Star journalists are less enamored with the imprimatur of a newspaper brand, and at the same time they crave the creative and financial freedom that comes with launching an independent media brand.
Paul Krugman's very upset all of a sudden, which is kind of weird because he was kind of feted, I thought, in the New York Times and was celebrated, and it was a big moment for them when he departed. And
yeah, they said nice things about him, and he was like, thank you, and by the way, F you.
Really having a go at them.
So Paul Krugman, full disclosure, is by
You're not
no
a big
means
fan, I would imagine.
my favorite columnist. Well, I, of course, recognize that he is a very smart man and is an eloquent representative of a side that I don't often agree with, although, of course, I agree with his opposition to the Iraq War, and I'm glad he made that case in a newspaper that was otherwise pretty supportive of said war. It is weird. He says they didn't want him to write as much on this blog, and he was like, well, then I'm not satisfied, so I'm going to write my own Substack blog thing, and they're like, okay, well, now you can have it. They over time installed more guardrails on what he could do. That's frustrating for anyone, I'm sure. So I understand and sympathize with his concerns there, and they're right that a big enough person as he is can absolutely thrive on their own on a Substack. So that Contrarian is the Jennifer Rubin little Substack that she started after departing the Washington Post. I don't know if this means he's going to write for them regularly. That would actually be a really big get. He's the opposite of Jennifer Rubin in every way, whereas he is someone I disagree with, but well thought out, well formulated arguments that are consistent, whereas Jen Rubin, ostensibly Republican on the right, publishes things that are, wild departures from what she used to believe with no explanation of why she has so dramatically changed her mind from first she was very anti-Mitt Romney, then she was very pro-Mitt Romney, so anti-Trump, all over the place. Paul Krugman is not like that.
No, he's not, and I'm sure Krugman will find, and has already found to some extent, an audience outside of the New York Times. One of the things I found about the reporting of this story a bit odd is it's almost a throwback to whenever there was almost no digital media, and so other branches of the media would be obsessed with the New York Times and its inner workings, and there was this whole subgenre of kind of Kremlinology around the New York Times. So Krugman also spoke to the Columbia Journalism Review, and it gets into all the detail about the specific editor who he thinks was too heavy-handed, and then the Columbia Journalism Review goes and talks to people like Tom Friedman, who are New York Times columnists, who say, no, that editor's fantastic, and I'm delighted he's my editor. Patrick Healy is the editor in question. And so it just gets into the bowels of the New York Times and its editing processes in a way that I think is perhaps has a limited audience, but we'll see.
I do understand the New York Times' desire to limit how much media criticism its columnists are doing.
Be a very bad idea for writing.
There's nothing media people want to do more than do media criticism. I love media criticism. I do a newsletter every week on media criticism.
Right.
But Paul Krugman he's a celebrated economist. Sure. So keeping the gist of his, the most of his commentary there is I see why something they would want to do. Also, the New York Times has weird rules about you're not supposed to criticize
other
Times columnists in public, and which is kind of an interesting. So they do gatekeep a little bit what you're allowed to discuss in terms of the media. So that part of it was nothing new.
No, they do, and that has been the case for years, because this is going back a long time to my first years in the US. Whenever the Iraq War had happened, Judith Miller was very controversial, and Maureen Dowd, who was a Times columnist, definitely attacked her publicly in some fashion. I can't remember whether it was a Maureen Dowd column or not. Look, I get why news organizations, particularly ones as significant as the New York Times, don't want their columnists like bashing each other in their columns. That seems bad.
Well, and generally in media, most business places don't bash your colleagues publicly or don't disparage their work.
Yeah.
I save my disagreements with Niall Stanage for the table.
As we should.
Yes.
And it doesn't sound like you'll be a subscriber to Mr. Krugman's Substack anytime soon, despite his Nobel Prize-winning pedigree.
His big mistake that he made, biggest mistake he ever made, was remember when he said that the internet would have proved to have no more impact on our way of life than the fax machine or something like that.
Something like that.
That did not quite pan out, my friend.
Not the greatest prediction, but any of us who make predictions are always vulnerable to being made to look idiots.
I just go back and delete all my incorrect predictions on X. So you'll
That's a very Trumpian attitude. Just delete history when it's inconvenient.
Maybe they'll put my face on Mount Rushmore.
Maybe they will. I'm sure it'll be delightful for us all.
That does it for us today on Rising. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you can find podcasts.